Introduce the panel before you here. My name is Bob Gardner, and I'm a senior vice president with SCS Engineers. I've been with SCS, over 40 years now. And during that time, I've had the privilege of working with many of you on this call and throughout the country and other cities and counties and authorities on a variety of solid waste issues and projects. With me today are Vita Quinn and Amy Jaloski. Vita directs our management services group, which works with municipalities throughout the country on various economic studies, and I'll let her introduce herself. And then we have Amy Jaloski, who's an urban planner with SCS, and but it also is in the unique position that she's also an elected official. She's a city council person for Stillwater, Oklahoma. So I think she'll bring some interesting perspectives. So Vita, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the heart and meat of the seminar.
Sure. Hi, I'm Vita. As Bob said, I'm the Director of Management Services for SCS, which is our public sector management consulting group. And what we do, among other things, is a lot of rate studies, fees, taxes, assessments, things like that, but also looking at funding and operational strategies. Basically anything that can help you with your finances and letting your finances stretch and work for you to help you meet your goals. As part of this, though, we work not just with solid waste and recycling, we work with all utilities and general funds, general governments, cities, counties, districts, special authorities. So a little bit of what we'll be touching on today is kind of a broader perspective, and I think that's where Amy comes in as well. Amy?
Sure. So my name's Amy Jaloski. I guess by day, I am the national practice lead for grants for SCS. I also do a lot of work with municipalities, cities, communities that are hoping to find additional funding, looking at redevelopment opportunities and things like that. I guess in the evenings and certainly through this pandemic, all my weekends, I serve my city as a city councilor. It's definitely been a challenging time. When I signed up to serve as a city councilor, I did not think I would be serving through a pandemic, as I imagine many of you did not think that you would be doing your jobs through a pandemic. But it's been interesting to watch, not only as a consultant helping our clients kind of move through this moment, but certainly as a city councilor watching our city staff and our community move through this moment. So hopefully we can have some of that conversation as well today.
Well, thanks. Well, let's take a look at the agenda and what we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to be talking just to set the stage with regards to the big picture approach to economic uncertainty. I think many of you are feeling that for sure. Address some of the issues relative to the economic factors that we're facing, how cities are responding, get into some details with regards to expense-based solutions, revenue strategies, and how you might ultimately optimize your operations to help with both the revenue side as well as the expense side. So let me turn to you, Vita, first. If you could kind of frame the issue as you see it, and what tools do municipalities have, and what strategies can they consider when addressing the unique issues that we're now facing as a result of the pandemic?
Sure. You know, the reason that Amy and I had originally wanted to talk to everybody is just to really encourage some of that broader thought, right? When we're making budgets, it gets very myopic. It's how much can I put in this line item? You know, what do I do in this fiscal year? And we tend to concentrate on only what's right in front of us. And in a time like this, where essentially all the cities and counties are completely upended, it helps, I think, to take a step back and say what's really happening, not just in solid waste, not just in my city, but in the economy as a whole, and how does that indirectly end up affecting me? So solid waste funds in particular, I think a lot more than even water and wastewater utilities, tend to be often interdependent with the general fund, often dependent on the general fund for money, even if they operate as enterprise funds, but really dependent on them for approval for things like vehicle replacements and small capital spending. So there's a lot of overlap there, and it helps also thinking about many solid waste utilities are part of a public works fund, which may take into account streets and other things along with it. So budgets may be developed in tandem. So I think being able to look at it from that perspective, as I'm part of a larger city, what are the general funds facing? What is my county facing? What is my state facing? Might help us to really walk through some of the potential solutions that you have. And I'll let Amy speak a bit more to that.
Sure. I think, you know, the first thing as the pandemic was hitting our community was, how do we staff these essential services? How do we continue to provide these essential services to our community? The trash still needed to be picked up. The, you know, like Bob said, the water still needs to run to our houses. So I think staffing was our first, kind of that physical staffing. And then we started to realize that this was really going to take a hit to our general fund. So what we've seen here so far in our community, and we're in Oklahoma, so we are the only state in the country that the municipalities are really run off of sales tax. So we expected, everybody's at home, nobody's shopping, we're really gonna take a ding here. Interestingly, we saw not a very large dip in our sales tax, but we still are bracing for a hit down the road. So we, as a city, have asked staff to look at, you know, different levels of funding decreases across departments. So whether that's a 10% or a 20%, you know, we're trying to look and understand what does it look like down the road. I think we've also, as we've opened back up after quarantine, we've also seen actually a little bit of a bump in our sales tax. We feel like what we're seeing is the leakage that normally comes out of our smaller community. Those dollars are being spent here as opposed to going to the larger cities that are in proximity to us. So we're trying to understand how long that might last. And we're also trying to understand, you know, we delayed capital projects at the very start. We're trying to understand at what point we might be able to release those capital projects. We had the good fortune in our community of having done some rate studies and fund studies recently, cost of services analysis. So we've been able to take a deeper dive, I think, because of those things, but it's kind of one step at a time, bracing for something bigger, trying to understand what those economic impacts are actually going to be.
So Vita, with regards to the tools that you have, you get the revenue, cost, rate structures, indirect cost allocations. Can you talk about those elements and what you specifically look at and when you begin to dive into a municipality's budget and their fiscal position?
Sure. So when we do what we would call a comprehensive rate study, which is everything, there's really several parts to it. And so I think that it is good to do what you're suggesting, Bob, kind of break down what we're talking about when we talk about rate studies or looking at your rates. The first step is really revenue sufficiency. That's, I think, what many people call rate studies, just saying how much do we need to raise our rates or increase our revenue by to be able to pay our bills, not just this year, but over a projection period, right? You make a capital plan for 5 or 10 years, but you tend to only make an operating budget for 1 to 2 years. It helps to play that out forward when you have these large capital projects coming out there and to really look at what it's going to take in the future to be able to pay for those bills that you know are going to be coming. In addition to that, looking at hiring needs, vehicle and equipment replacement needs, and really making sure that your budget incorporates all of those items rather than just the very bottom line that you can use to get by from one year to the next, because things like that end up with consequences in the future, with aging infrastructure, aging fleet, that becomes more difficult to repair than it does to actually replace at some point. So that's what revenue sufficiency looks at. And then once we have that, it becomes important to have the conversation about where does that revenue need to come from, or flipping that on its head, who is the one that's generating that revenue? Which of our customers are really costing us? Which of the functions that we provide cost us? And of the functions we provide, how much does it cost to provide these services? Quite often, there are things that we tend to label as free services. So for example, in solid waste, you may have certain drop-off centers, you may have events for residents to bring, household hazardous waste or e-waste or other things. And those are offered free to residents, but the money has to come from somewhere. I mean, I worked with a small municipality out west that their yard waste drop-off, like roll-offs throughout the city alone, were about $375,000 a year. And then I'm working right now with a client that they offer free household hazardous waste events and a recycling drop-off center that's shared not only by residents of the city, but by other cities that may come and drop off there. Well, the HHW events alone are $80,000 a year. So it's kind of time to say, okay, what are those costs to provide these services? Who is creating those costs? And then the next step is really the revenue recovery, which is the true rate study, the rate structure. Once we can quantify the costs, we have to divide that among the benefiting accounts, the customers, the residents that come and avail themselves of those services. So there's my garbage truck going by. So the rate structure just really attempts to look at how we provide those services. What is the labor component? What's the equipment component? What are the facilities involved? And really making sure that we recover the correct amount from the customers that are benefiting.
So as you look at the issue of the revenue sufficiency and the residential customers, there's varying classes of residential customers for sure. And during this pandemic, you have some in our community that are struggling. And how do you deal with the issue of rate equity, allocation of cost, or you got to continue providing the services, but there may be some people who can't afford it. And how do you deal with that? How do cities deal with that you've seen?
It is a difficult question, and I'm sure Amy can probably speak a lot more to how that is politically. But we try to, whenever we design rates, to really focus on what we would think of as the average residential customer. In particular, we're looking at someone who is maybe elderly and on a fixed income. These are the people who are going to most likely be affected by small changes in the rates that they have to pay, and the ones who are most likely to be vocal at public meetings and just simply say, I can't afford to pay this much more. So when we look at those structures, we try to focus on that. If we realize that the rates are out of line with the cost of service, maybe commercial isn't quite paying enough, we try to shift that burden there. But to some extent, once we know what the costs are to provide residential services, there's only so much we can do. And I can talk about some other strategies to take some of that burden off the individual user rate. But once we get to that point that we do know what the rate is, there are strategies that cities and counties can employ to help. And that would involve cooperation with the general funds, because that's usually where that subsidy would come from. But there are things sometimes called a lifeline rate that are for some of those essential domestic requirements. We often see it with water and wastewater, but it can apply in solid waste as well. Something that allows you to continue your services, maybe at a discounted rate, if you apply for it. Show that you're on fixed income or have a disability or above a certain age. And these are city policies, but that way, not only do they get a lower rate, but because you're cooperating with the general funds, make sure those funds come from somewhere, that burden is not put back on your other customers.
So,
Amy,
So Amy, as a city council person, how do you manage that? You got a political issue you got to deal with. You've got to run the city. So just curious.
Sure. So that really resonates with us right now, right? There's so many people in our community that are hurting, whether they're unemployed or have been furloughed. Their incomes have been impacted. Their ability to pay has been impacted. I'm sure similar to many of the communities around the country, our community had a moratorium on shutoffs at the very beginning during kind of the more hardcore quarantine and isolation at home. And so we're just in the process of starting to go through payment plans and identifying, how we can help customers get back on track in terms of their utility bills. I think one of the things from a political perspective, it's really challenging to think about raising rates right now, even though we had just completed a solid waste study that was suggesting that we do some rate raising over the next 5 or 6 years. It's challenging to think about that right now. I think one of the things we're trying to do with staff is figure out where we might have efficiencies and also figure out where we might have, those one-off services that Vito was talking about and what the real cost of providing those services might be. And if those are opportunities to raise the rates of those items as opposed to an overall rate raise. So I think in our community, one thing, I mean, it's very small, and I'm sure there's multiple small things that can compile to have a bigger impact. And I know, Vita, you can probably help us think of some of those things. But I know one of the first things that we realized as we were kind of going through and itemizing, because we had done that deep dive, was that our waste oil cost, the cost of dropping off motor oil, was not enough to cover the cost of transporting that. So that was a simple thing that we could raise the rate because that was what it actually cost. But we're also asking staff to look at, permit costs and other kind of user fees and things like that that really reflect the true use of those things in addition to different efficiencies.
So Vito, on the cost of service, that's a big, big step in the way of terms of unraveling the problem, so to speak, to make sure that you understand and how that cost and how that's allocated. Can you talk a little bit about that with regards to, and almost it seems like for example, solid waste is always, no pun intended, the dumping ground for lots of things that they don't have a home for anything else. So let's put it in either the solid waste department or something like that. And sometimes at junctures like this, you almost push back and say, well, we'll cover what is appropriate to our enterprise fund, for example, and our mission. And so there's got to be, it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. And so how does that fit in the overall strategies for dealing with the issues that we're facing at this juncture?
Yeah, I've definitely seen solid waste utilities who are responsible for everything from canal dredging to cleaning bus shelters. So that can be varied. And in some cases, so for example, bus shelter cleaning, there's not much you can do to charge anyone. You don't go to the bus stop and ask for reimbursement. In that case, we work it out with the general fund. We find a way that we can fund those activities that are outside of what maybe our residential customers should be paying for, because not in all cases does the solid waste utility serve every customer in the city, but some of the functions that they provide serve every resident within the city or county. So there has to be a way to recover those costs outside of the residential rates. There's also making sure that we adequately allocate costs to specific functions or specific waste streams that we accept. Often at landfills, there will be just sort of a nominal charge for things like tires or appliances or what they'll call special objects. And those can be very, very out of line with the cost of service. If you can imagine the difference in just a small passenger car tire and a very large truck or tractor tire, making sure that you differentiate so that the cost really reflects the cost to handle those goods. I've also seen municipalities that would accept special objects that would be anything that doesn't normally cross across the gate and doesn't particularly fit on the scale very well. So you have mobile homes coming through and they're charging, I don't know, a couple $100s. And I said, okay, well, realistically, let's talk about this. How long does it take you? Oh, it's half a day and a dedicated piece of equipment. Well, then it sounds like we're not charging nearly enough for those one-offs. And what happens in the case of the landfill is that gets wrapped up into everyone else's tipping fee, which means your MSW, your municipal solid waste tipping fee, is helping to subsidize some of those one-off services. The same thing can be true for other functions that would be in the collections rates. We have a city that I'm working with that has within some of the special functions they provide, there are supporting special events, which my understanding was have permit fees associated with them. And those permit fees are meant to cover all the costs of supporting large events within a city, coming back and collecting dumpsters or roll-off containers, and sometimes even involved in fortification or blocking off certain large events. But, in asking them how those fees were calculated and whether they were sufficient, basically people just laugh. They know that they haven't looked at them in a long time, and that the entire fee may not even be enough just to support the cost of solid waste, much less some of those other things. So that opens a can of worms into then now asking, well, what about all of your allocations and reimbursements within the city? You mentioned indirect cost allocation earlier. That, along with reimbursements, or how the city pays itself for different services. So the general funds provide things like finance and human resources, and solid waste may provide solid waste services to other utilities and departments within the general fund. What are the mechanisms in place to get reimbursed for those costs? Because again, they should not be in everyone's collection rates. And in the case of the permit fees, there should be a specific reimbursement process where they can track the costs to provide services to those events, whether that's upfront based on an agreed level of service, or whether that's tracking what they have to do during the event. But there should be a reimbursement process in place so that solid waste isn't effectively just bearing the burden of doing things like you were saying that didn't have a home anywhere else within the general fund.
One of the comments that were made, Kimberly, I'll probably mispronounce your last name, Shively, she would suggest that the municipalities stop using the word free and start saying what it really is, already paid for through the rate. She tells customers it's not a free service, but it's available at no additional cost, so that they understand that the program already has been paid for through their rates, which I think is a good comment.
We're definitely careful when we do presentations in front of elected officials. We're very careful that we don't refer to anything as free, and that we in fact go out of our way to quantify that. Here's how much your yard waste collection costs you. Here's how much your bulk pickups cost you. So that whether or not it's wrapped up in the residential rates, both the elected officials and the residents can understand that there's truly a cost to those services. There's a benefit even to separating the recycling fee from the solid waste fee, so that people understand that recycling actually does have a cost associated with it and isn't a money maker, which is sometimes still a commonly held misconception.
So I know you use this technique that you call microanalysis to dive into a municipality's budget and expenses in order to help them solve problems on a quick and inexpensive way. And I thought we'd kind of do a little pivot here and talk about that, what's involved with the microanalysis. What is it? What does it cost to do? How does it work? What can a municipality gain from this kind of analysis? So can you talk about that a little bit and maybe show us some things as to how that's done?
Sure. One of the things that's happened recently is that everyone's plan that we had 6 or 8 months ago has been completely turned on its head. There is no right answer for financial sustainability right now. No one even knows what their budget is going to work out to be this fiscal year. As we've finally gotten mostly through the budget process, we're still pretty aware that there's going to be mid-year budget changes. We have a very loose handle on the economic environment and how the outfall of some of those things might affect cities and indirectly the utilities as well. So we are doing a micro form of our revenue sufficiency analysis. We are still doing the same things, asking what is it that you need in terms of money to pay the bills and the capital that you require, and what's the timing and funding sources for your projects going to look like. But really focusing a little bit more on the short to medium term, understanding there are still long-term projects out there that may be critical. So for example, if you're in a landfill and you have a cell that's closing and there's another one that has to be opened, if you can continue to operate, you don't have a choice there. So there's very little you can do in terms of even timing, but maybe we can talk about funding sources, different strategies for that. But with the microanalysis, we're really just trying to get you through these 1 to 2 fiscal years without ruining your long-term outlook. Because what's happened this year is we've had some municipalities that were set up for double-digit rate increases because they hadn't had a rate adjustment in quite a while, and even needed to borrow funds from the general fund. And the answer just came back, no. Well, there's an impact to that, to prolonging the need for rate adjustments into the future, because it makes it just that much more dramatic on your customers' rates later on. So we're trying to work with other solutions. You know, some of the things we talked about, like optimizing some of our other fees or diversifying some fees. Are there things we're just not charging for that we could be? And a lot of miscellaneous charges, it may only be a few $1,000s a year, or these nominal fees that were put into place sometime in the 90s. You know, it's $25 for a bad check return. Is that really how much it costs you to process that? You know, all these other little fees that seem to be very round numbers that we maybe haven't asked questions about in a long time. It's a time to look at some of those things, and if you can quantify them, to test the impact on your financial outcomes. So I'll share something with you that we've been using with our clients. This is just sort of a sample of what one of these analyses would look like.
And I'll just say, if it comes up on your screen, you have the ability to also adjust the size of how you're viewing this. So if there's a little thing that you can pull to make the screen larger for you if you need to see this.
That's probably not going to help.
Looks
so
good.
what you're looking at here is a panel to one of our financial models. This is customized to a client that had some questions, but I'll show you kind of generally what you're looking at. The projected need for revenue adjustments is here. So saying that the rates need to go up by about 4.5% per year. It will generate about this much revenue. So it's in millions, so about 220,000 in revenue for that 4.5%. And then we've customized some scenarios. This particular client really needed to fund a certain amount in their closure and post-closure funds to meet some of their financial assurance estimates and be able to have a realistic amount to be able to fund future projects. And at the rate they were going with the transfers that they were doing into that fund, they weren't going to get there by the time that they needed that money. They were at about half of where they needed to be. We'll get to that a little bit more in a moment, and some of the strategies that we can come up with to help them. Then we have two graphs down here at the bottom. This one looks at borrowing. This city is somewhat debt averse, but there is a larger capital project happening in some of the out years that they were willing to borrow for, but they wanted to minimize that as much as possible. And so you'll see in both of these graphs that there are green and yellow bars right next to one another. This is just allowing us to compare scenarios side by side. So as we change some of the assumptions, the yellow bars will stay the same and those green bars will move. This fund balance graph is what you're really watching. This is one of our key metrics. This is how much money do I have in the bank relative to my minimum working capital reserve target, which is this red line. The red line represents about 3 months of operating expenses, which is a minimum that you would want to see for a healthy utility. In general, that can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months of operating expenses you want to have just to be able to withstand, you know, seasonality and fluctuations within the fiscal year. So in this case, the 4.5% is what it took for them to be able to cash fund most of their projects and still have a sufficient amount in the bank and minimize their borrowing. But given everything that's happened in the economy, this may not be the best situation right now to plan for a 4.5% rate adjustment next year. So Amy, I'm going to let you, from an elected official perspective, tell me what you'd like to see.
Sure. So I think, you know, when you first come into an elected role, one of the first things that we want to know as we're trying to get our bearings is just how much money does it cost to do this? How much money should we be setting aside to make sure that we have everything we need down the road? So I'm wondering, you know, you said earlier that the funds that they were setting aside for closure, post-closure, was not sufficient. So if you make an adjustment there, I'm wondering what that looks like for this community.
Sure. So I do know that about $325,000 a year will get us to where we need to be by the end of the projection period. So just shy of that 3.8 million that they need to have in reserves. And so what you can see happened is that we have a need now to borrow earlier than we had, but that borrowing in 2029 is significantly reduced. So that may be acceptable to the council. And we fall slightly below our reserve target in 1 year, but for the most part, it does look like we're still there. So I would say that you could actually fund that additional transfer out and still maintain your plan.
So if we've got still some extra in there, is there anything else that you could do to adjust the model so that maybe we're not looking at increases in the rates as high as we would normally be looking at?
Sure. And I know 4.5% can be a lot to sell politically. We usually want to see if we can get rate increases somewhere a little bit closer to inflation, or what people think of as inflationary like. So 2.5% to 3% would be ideal. So let's see what we can do to at least bring that down slightly. One of the things that I like to recommend to clients in general is that you create a vehicle and equipment replacement reserve that you contribute an even amount into every year, so that you can cash fund your needs in each year out of that fund, instead of having to come up with $200,000 one year and then $1.3 million another year. Smoothing those costs can really help you over time. So if I average out the vehicle spending, it really makes a big difference in my fund balances over time. So now I'm in excess of my target reserve in every year, which, in answer to your question, Amy, means I should be able to take my need for rate increases down a bit. Let's try 3.5%. Might even be able to go slightly lower. So it looks like 3.25 is probably about as low as we can go to still meet our financial targets and be able to fund everything that we want. Now, this does come with increased borrowing in the out years, but I think, given some of what we're experiencing in the near term, maybe the general fund might be agreeable to that. You could also probably bundle some of these borrowings into just one larger borrowing.
So Vita, I noticed too that you've got a 0% rate increase for FY21. I know, we're still dealing with a community that's still struggling. We don't really know what the recovery cycle is going to look like. What happens if you go to a 0% rate increase in FY22?
Yeah, and that is something we're hearing a lot right now, is that, obviously this year, pretty much no one got the rate adjustments that they were asking for. But, there is the expectation that over the next 1 to 2 years, it might be very difficult politically and financially for many customers to be able to significantly increase their rates. So if I put 0 in 2022 and I leave it at 3.25% going forward, we will see the impact of that time value of our money. Now we're out of money by 2026, which of course is not feasible. So let's see what it would take. We need to go back up to 4. Still significantly below our target reserve. So we might be right back at that 4.5%. So it would at least take 4.5%. Even with that, you're still below your target reserve balances in several years. But I have a feeling that council's probably not willing to go any higher than that, but it does show you the impact of delaying the need for rate increases.
So when you're doing this kind of analysis, Vita, what this is kind of the revenue sufficiency, what cost of this kind of quick look at things? What is it typically time and cost to do something like this?
So there's, let me stop sharing so I can look at you again.
There you go.
There's normally so much that goes into the background of these analyses, where we ask for several years of history. We look at your budgeted spending versus your actual spending. We look at the growth in your system. We make adjustments to your capital plan. If we really just do a back of the napkin, in particular, a lot of our clients that we've already worked with, so we kind of know some of their history, have come back to us. And taking advantage of virtual meetings. There is a cost savings that is worth thinking about as well as you get prices for projects going forward. There's a cost savings to having virtual meetings. We're not traveling. We can have meetings more frequently. It has been a benefit to our customers. So we're able to offer this close to, depending on the size of the city, it's working out to be anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000. The more significant difference being we can produce these results in a meeting, get some data, have a meeting, and really within 2 or 3 days have a couple page technical memorandum and some schedules with results, which is much more efficient, especially when we're in the middle of all these budget changes and the answers can't be 3 months in process. You need the answers now.
There are a couple of interesting comments that were made. One from John Wang from the city of Baltimore and Glenda Steiner, similar kind of comments. John indicated that they've got to justify their CIP allocation based upon equity, and that their solid waste general fund, the tipping fees, is submitted back to the general fund, and their equity is presented in a citywide GIS mapping. And so he was asking any recommendations on the opportunity of addressing equity for them. And he's given his email that he can address, and he might be able to comment on it. And also Glenda said that there's been lawsuits against municipalities when costs for the general fund services have been paid for by the enterprise service departments, which I know you're dealing with a particular municipality that's had that happen to them as well. Any comments on those relative to these kinds of analyses?
Sure. So I'll address the first question first. Regarding equity, that is the purpose of that cost allocation. We really go into it to not only allocate your operational costs, but your capital costs as well. And what we do to really make sure the rates are adequate, we'll kind of also look at your 5-year plan, because we will generally tell you, you always need to have a full rate study about once every 5 years. So then let's look at your 5-year plan of capital and make sure those costs get allocated to the groups that are benefiting from them. And so, you know, as far as cash funding goes, that's the way we look at that. Debt funding will allocate that debt service, but that's an additional layer of really equity, making sure that your future customers are paying for those assets over the life of the asset. So that's a way to look at borrowing as really creating intergenerational equity there as well. So yes, it is a big focus. As far as departmental allocations, that is a problem. It's a problem everywhere. It should be part of a larger rate study as well. Really saying, what are the functions that we provide, right? We talked about that in the cost allocation. But then the next question is, can those functions be included in our customer rates? Because if they are entirely unrelated, and like I said, if you're not serving every resident and every business within the city, then you cannot burden the residential or the rates of the customers you serve with services that benefit everyone in the community. And in the cases of some of the municipalities I talked about earlier, when you're having events or things that may benefit residents outside the community, you know, there can be a city or county desire to fund those services, but it shouldn't be done through utility rates. And so it is really important to quantify those and to look at those reimbursements, those indirect cost allocations, make sure that they're up to date about every 5 years or as your service levels and your demographics change.
One of the other things that we've seen in the last couple of months in terms of what municipalities have in their toolbox in order to deal with the cost side of things is, you know, if you look at a solid waste budget, in my experience has been, you know, collection could represent 75% of the budget, and disposal maybe 25% of the budget. So when you really look at where can I get the best bang for my buck, you know, collections is a big area where you can ultimately get some savings. And what we've been doing recently in a number of communities is doing route optimization. In other words, you may be 5 years, 10 years out where you haven't looked at your routes and you've had growth in your city. And so things have gotten unbalanced. And so, you know, doing a route optimization, you know, I found you pay for that within, you know, a couple of months. Typically, when you look at the cost of a truck, $350,000 for a truck, and, you know, $80,000 all in for a driver and support, you know, so doing that kind of route optimization. We had one client we had a proposal. They said, when we first started the project about 1.5 years ago, they said, well, that's an optional task. Yeah. As soon as the pandemic hit, we got a call and says, we would like to kind of do that optimization work. And it will literally pay for itself in no time. Amy?
I think you bring up a really good point, Bob. I think, you know, I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that we wanted to look at in our community was what efficiencies could we provide? And I think, you know, those are immediate efficiencies that we need to look to. But one of the things I'm hopeful for, even though we're kind of running around with our hair on fire, trying to figure out the immediate effects of this, I'm hopeful that some of the work that we do, some of the harder fiscal work that we do will help us be more resilient moving forward, so that we're doing those deep dives into our efficiencies, into our costs of services. We're having stronger interdepartmental conversations about efficiencies as well. But I hope that that helps us build a more resilient, whether it's a resilient fund balance that needs to be there, or just resilient operations moving forward. It seems like this has kind of laid bare some of the challenges that our communities face, and it's an opportunity to address them in the short term, but also in the long term. I think one of the neat things that we've seen in our general fund is that there's a lot of opportunities right now, and I think we'll see more hopefully moving forward for different revenue streams kind of coming in, whether that's through grants or CARES Act funding or those different things. And we've seen some opportunities where, for instance, in our community, the airport was given a full grant, 100% grant for their typical funding from Federal Aviation Administration. Normally they have a 20% match, and they were able to give that 20% match back to the general fund. So other departments benefited from that grant funding coming through at a different level. And I think we're having bigger conversations around those things as well, to see where we might have additional revenue streams, where we might have additional efficiencies and things like that.
We have a question from Kevin Lugo. He says that in his community, about 90,000 residents, they have a significant litter and illegal dumping problem. And much of the cost is abatement. And they said that they haven't done a good job at prevention and enforcement in the past. And currently, this is paid out of the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund, which is about 25% of their fee, which is a pretty big hit. And he was wondering, do other communities fund this type of work in the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund? You have any experience with that?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought this up, because this is one of the things that I really wanted to mention today. There is the opportunity to also distribute costs among the different general fund departments or enterprise funds that benefit from certain services. So yes, it is fairly common to see illegal dumping and litter cleanup within the solid waste fund, but asking yourself, where could these services potentially be funded, or where are they funded in other cities or counties, is a way to look at potentially a cost allocation and cost sharing. So for example, if lot clearing and mowing and some of that illegal dumping would otherwise be done by a crew of Parks and Rec, some of the people that are normally dealing with trees and mowing, might you share some of those costs? If street sweeping is under solid waste, but technically it benefits both streets and stormwater, maybe there's a chance to share costs there. Kind of what Amy was going back to. If there's less of a burden on the airport this year because they have some additional funds, well, then maybe if we're sharing some costs that can be borne by the airport, maybe it's time to really look at allocating those costs. It does sound like that's a really significant portion of your budget. So I would really consider that. The other thing that you could do is also, and this would be a financial policy, so you'd really have to work with the general fund on this one, but is there a way to, in certain circumstances, charge the individual parcel owner for the costs that they're generating for the city? So if I specifically have to come and clean up your lot, and this has happened maybe on multiple occasions, can you bill them directly, either on the tax bill or sending a bill to them? Those costs may not be easy to recover, but to some extent, especially if it's on the tax bill, it could become a lien on the property and you may have a better chance of recouping those costs. So there's some other strategies maybe you could look at as well.
We have another question, and the question is, what suggestions do we have with regards to route efficiencies and MSW collection until funding can be allocated for an optimization study? And I'll take a swing at that one. One of the approaches that we've taken is to have workshops with the collection crews and the supervisors. And so that can be done over a 1, 2, 3 day period. It's very difficult to do with your collection because you're doing that every day, but maybe you have a 4-day-a-week collection. So you can, if Wednesday's your day off, maybe you can pull everybody together on Wednesday, sit down with the route maps and work through some ideas with regards to how can you make some adjustments immediately that can help your optimization before you go through and actually do a full rerouting of an area. We found we've used that approach on probably 3 separate projects recently, where we would just do a really quick review and sit down. Relatively inexpensive. You're probably spending less than $5,000-$10,000 to kind of get at how can you really save some big monies with regards to how your ultimate routes are balanced.
We found that in the past too. It's amazing how we forget sometimes to ask the people who are doing the work whether this is the best way to do it. And you quite often find that when you ask them, okay, this is the worst, this route is terrible, because I end up going through and I hit we worked with a city out in Arizona at one point, we hit the interstate at this time, which puts me in the middle of rush hour. And then I'm in a line at the transfer station. I have to do the same thing in reverse when people coming home, when I come back. And if we just simply did it this way, you just give them a chance to tell you what would work better. And then you kind of have to map it out, obviously, but I mean, it's good to be able to bring the people who are doing the work into the conversation.
I did a ride along out in a community out in Northern California. And, as we're driving around, it would happen to be right when school was in session. And he's saying, my routes change depending on when school's in session, because he does not want to be running his trucks, these big trucks, down the road when you got kids walking down the sidewalk going to school. So he said he changes his route during the course of the year. He starts at one end of the route instead of this end of the route to allow the kids to get to school before he runs by. And it made me nervous as I was sitting on the passenger side of the truck, and you can see all these kids. I'm going, man, it won't take 2 seconds if you're not really paying attention, you could have a real bad situation. Well, we are at about the 50-minute mark, and I'm sure people have heard enough from us at this juncture. And I want to see if there are any other questions that people might have before we kind of close it up and summarize some of the take-homes relative to what we've talked about today. So I'll kind of sit here for a minute or two, and you can potentially either raise your hand or send a note, a question in the question and answer feature. Here comes a question coming in. This is from Diane. Will you describe the microanalysis mentioned in your blog, and how does it compare with the model shown today?
Same model, just a little bit simpler, a little bit quicker. We may not go into as much depth outside of the near term. We'll just go with your planned capital and your known hiring. We won't look at as much at your history. We'll kind of go with your understood growth rate that you're planning for in the city. It's really meant to just focus mostly on the operational and capital needs in the near term, but it is the same model.
Another question.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, we also can do kind of a quick look at what other revenue streams might be available from a grant perspective. If there's state programs or federal programs that might have some cash available to help with capital projects or different planning components that you're looking at, we can do a quick look at that as well.
That was a question actually Kevin Lugo just asked. He says, are there any private federal sources of financial aid for struggling municipal programs, especially ones that would support staff salaries? Do you have any experience there that might be helpful?
I don't know specifically for staff salaries. So obviously what we're seeing right now, kind of similar to what we saw back in the economic crisis back in 2008, 2009, is that a lot of the existing federal programs are being infused with more cash. So there may be more funding available, more projects may be funded, or they may be funded at higher amounts. So if you're working with any existing federal or state programs, it's worth your while to go back and check with them to see, are they going to be going out again for another call for projects? It's also worthwhile to look at some of the ones that maybe you haven't worked with in the past. I know there's a lot of state programs that focus on recycling or food waste and things like that. I know USDA often has funding available for solid waste and wastewater projects. EPA has some different funding available during the year. So those are all places to go back and look. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be specific to staff salaries right now.
No, but along with what you're saying too, I mean, sometimes there are even certain loans that are more favorable. that may even have principal forgiveness. But we have to keep in mind, and this is why we bring Amy into these conversations, to look at the timing of those receipts of money. So often they may require that you're either doing a match or spending money up front. And so that may come later. But as far as the staff salaries go, you know, any burden you take off of your operating budget by funding your capital differently will help to free up funds for staffing.
The other thing you might look at, I don't know specifically, I don't know of any community that's specifically doing this, but I know if you did have any CARES Act funding come your way, there is a lot of ways to be creative with how those dollars are being used in terms of how they're funding essential services. So that could be, you know, police and fire, obviously protective services, but it may be something that you're able to take a deeper dive into how those CARES Act dollars might be available if you're a community that's received those.
Another question, is it common to require commercial accounts to use city provided services before private haulers?
I mean, Bob, you could probably speak better to this. I see it mentioned a lot in Virginia when we worked with clients there, but yes, there is a way that you can.
I think it's a function really of what your franchise rules are that you have in your community, what type of statutes you have in place to require it. I know plenty of places where they require the commercial accounts to use the city services. And it's just a matter of ordinances that have been put in place and the ability to make sure that that happens.
It's also important to consider, even if you are going to allow other haulers to serve your residents, that you consider the revenue diversification opportunities you have there as well. So are you charging franchise fees? Do you have permitted haulers that have to pay permit fees annually? There are a number of different ways to make sure that you're not suffering for the fact that there are businesses that maybe just with economies of scale could serve commercial customers better.
Right. I mean, there's one community that we're working on in Western Texas where they have commercial collection, but that commercial collection is defined by the container type that they use. And that in the case that there's like 3 cubic yards and below, and then the larger front end loader containers, they allow the privates to haul at this juncture, although they're interested ultimately in potentially doing that service. But right now that's the way they've got it structured. So all those 3 cubic yard containers are handled by the city by ordinance. And then the larger ones can be handled by the commercial haulers. So it's kind of an interesting deal. Got another question here. In Pennsylvania, let's see here. It's a long question. Let's see if I can read it here. Yes, many were created long before the pandemic, but are still good resources in Pennsylvania. For example, the DEP established a system. Oh, this is dealing with some of the funding programs in Pennsylvania that are out there relative to the 101 Act 101. So, okay. Well, let's kind of go to the last slide if we could. If you could pop it up on the screen, it kind of summarizes where we've been today and what we've talked about relative to the overall issues that we've been facing.
So just a few things to consider, and I'll start with expenses because I feel like there's only so much you can do there, especially when you've really tightened your budget already. Some of the things that we think it's important that you do consider though is what we talked about with sharing costs across different departments, across different enterprise funds for services that maybe will benefit both. Back to some of what Bob mentioned, look at your operational changes, look at your routing efficiencies, look at things like that you can change to use your resources more wisely before deferring capital or important projects. When I worked for local government, we survived on attrition for a while to avoid having to furlough people and to be able to afford some of the costs of operations. So consider that too as people approach retirement. Can you be smarter about your routing and really get by on one less person?
Yeah, I think we certainly are looking at those types of things in our community. I think some other things from an expenses perspective that we could look at As you ran through the model, you were looking at different debt service, are there alternatives to just that cash only model? And I think, as you mentioned too, there in this new reality that happens to be all on our computers, there's an opportunity to take an advantage of some of the consultants and things that are working for you to reduce the cost of providing some of those services and having those conversations. Having those virtual meetings is a great way to get things done quickly and less expensively.
On the revenue side, given that we want to avoid rate adjustments to our average residential user wherever possible, really looking at the fees that you charge, whether there are fees that you could be charging that you aren't, or fees that have not been updated in a long time that are just some sort of nominal number but may have a real cost behind them. Any of those miscellaneous charges or any of those free services that you provide that could be quantified and possibly even have a charge associated with them. And then looking at your indirect cost allocations and interdepartmental reimbursements, understanding that you should not be providing services for free to anyone, even internally, and that there should be a mechanism and a methodology update periodically to make sure that if you do have a cost allocation or reimbursement process that relies on some sort of methodology, that's up to date based on how you do business.
You're helping your city councilor when you do that. You're helping us not have to go out to the public and raise those rates, which is, I think it's just certainly where we are right now. As most communities, I think it's really challenging to go back and ask for the community to take on those rate increases. I think from another perspective in revenue, the idea of diversifying revenues, it's definitely a time. Hopefully we'll see more focused opportunities coming out of the federal government for different grant programs and subsidies. It's definitely a time to take stock of what projects you would like to have funded. Are they shovel ready? I think we'll see that term come up in these funding cycles. Are you tracking expenses for FEMA reimbursement? Are you looking at your CARES Act funding? So really preparing now for those opportunities so that you're ready to take advantage of them. And then we talked a little bit about this today, but moving forward, making sure that we're developing policies that fund strategic reserves. So as Vita was going through that microanalysis, going through the model, really understanding what we actually need to have in those reserve funds to stay resilient and sustainable.
And we didn't talk about this today, but there is definitely some opportunity to make sure that you are adequately funding other reserves. We mentioned like a vehicle and equipment reserve. A lot of times there are capital reserves, but consider going forward contributions into a rate stabilization reserve, something that will allow you to get through these economic fluctuations, natural disasters, things like that. For each system, that's a different number. It just has to help you quantify what's a disaster to you and start to slowly fund that over time. Probably not a good time to suggest firing one of those up right now, but if you have one, it's time to dip into it.
Well, I mean, you think about Oklahoma, you get tornadoes, Florida, you have hurricanes, West has fires, earthquakes. And so you got to plan for those kinds of things more so now, it seems. They seem to be coming more frequently, for sure. I think in Oklahoma City, I remember when we did a project for them, they figured that every time there was a major tornado, it was an $8 million hit to their fund, their solid waste fund. So they wanted to have basically 2 years of reserves for that. Hurricanes might be the same thing. Pandemics now are bringing in another issue.
I was going to say that's the next thing to add to the list for those rate stabilization funds. I think we've certainly learned that we need to have some strategies and policies around preparedness for things like this.
Well, Vita,
Amy, your elected officials, by the way, giving every dollar a purpose like that goes a long way at those budget meetings. It's not that we have excess fund balance, it's that we're contributing to our rate stabilization reserve so we can avoid rate increases significantly in the future.
Well, Vita and Amy, thank you so much for taking time today. Hopefully this has been helpful for all of you who have participated, and we want to thank you for doing so. This, as we said, was recorded and will be available online if you need to view this later, or if you have other colleagues that you would like to maybe listen to some of the discussion that we had today. We hope that this conversation that we had together was helpful for you. Again, we thought it would be interesting to take a little bit different approach than just going through a bunch of PowerPoint slides. So again, thanks for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.